Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this is a somewhat poorly lit Sergeant Dorian Black, a model that's a little rare, a little special, and should be quite fun for us today. It is a 54mm model from the, unfortunately terrible, Inquisitor narrative-led wargame that I painted many years ago before I knew what a highlight was. The knowledgeable collectors amongst you might also notice that the head has been swapped for Slick Devlin's head, also from 54mm Inquisitor. It's also covered in dust, hang on a second. Well, I have recently been painting a vast quantity of Tanith first and only models, an Imperial Guard force for the 2832 sized Warhammer 40k. Well, I had the unbreakable urge to redo my 54mm Imperial Guard model as one of Gaunt's ghosts. So let's utterly ruin the work I did 20 years ago and see if my recently learned skills are worth anything. And that begins by pulling it apart, so that we can clean it and start from the miniature equivalent of a blank canvas. Thankfully, this is really easy to do as it was put together with superglue, and superglue is anything but super. With the plastic base safely put aside, I dipped all of the other pieces into acetone for the grand long time of about 15 seconds. I often see people talking about soaking metal minis in acetone overnight or for several days, and it just isn't necessary. It's going to eat through acrylic paints or spray paint in seconds. Just keep the brush wet with acetone and it'll rub off in no time flat. Well, now to rebuild and modify the model, and I am wonderfully lucky with this as I still have the lasgun in my bits box, and it just about still fits the model's hand. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this originally was a separate piece or if I cut it. I think I cut it because it doesn't quite match. There is a little filling needed, and some of the dreaded superglue was able to fill the kerf once some baking powder was carefully put at the joint. Otherwise, this step is pretty simple. Just cut out the caked in superglue and re-glue the pieces together. And now for the biggest and most important step. If I'm to turn this somewhat generic ye olde style Cadian into a Tanith trooper, there's one big important piece that it needs: the Camellia Line Cloak. My regular viewers will be familiar with my recent experiments with sculpting, particularly with Tanith camo cloaks. I have successfully made a few, and some of them even look like fabric, but importantly I've learned a fair amount. But now, by doing things on a different scale, I can use that learning, but also learn more. Importantly, I want to learn if the things I've learned already carry up in scale. A 54mm model is 1.6 or 1.7 times the size of a 28mm one. There is a step up here, but how significant is that step? I do know that throwing a chunk of milliput on the model and trying to flatten it into a cloak doesn't end well, so I start on a big flat piece of silicone. This gives me the opportunity to get the most general shape, the silhouette, and smooth out both sides of cracks and the craggy texture from mixing, and this is the best time to make the edges neat and tidy. The edges will almost certainly need to be redone later on, as I move stuff around on the model, and the texture I create during the process will also need dealing with, but it is a good starting point. Well, I put the blank camo cloak on and it looked horrible. It looked like a dumb sheet of clay thrown on a model, not a cloak. I wanted to rip it off again and start from scratch, but I had the thought that I could start again at any point, so long as I was still in the curing time of the milliput, and that's easy to do. So I took this as a practice run and poked at it and prodded. I pulled a wedge out to help it sit flat against the back. I shuffled some material around his chest and adjusted how it draped over the arm, trying to ensure that it wouldn't tear at this point, as milliput often wants to do. The right side of the cloak ended up the messiest at this stage. Milliput is easy to squish together, so simply adding an extra blob onto it and pushing it together forms it into one piece. And as long as you work it together during its cure time, then it'll be one piece when it finishes curing. And all these extra pieces added this way don't just have to be the flat base of my cloak. I can put in half a loop, smush the edges into the shoulders, and make a hood. This is a very similar technique to the smaller scale. One important thing that I learned on some of the previous models is that sculpting folds into the cloak is possible by adding an extra stripe of milliput and pushing it and pressing it into shape. It's far easier to achieve this when you have some backing for the model, so for the most part for a cloak I would have to wait for the first layer to cure and then add in a second layer. So what I had planned was to just make out the basic shape, clean the edges, and let it cure. However, the back of the cloak is up against the Mini's back, and it's tight against the shoulder and chest, and not far off the legs. That means I can at least get started on some of these folds, so naturally that means I got caught up and did more than half of the work. Sculpting can be very similar to painting in some ways. Frustrating and technical at first while you work out the fundamentals, the workflow and the basic principles of how it actually works. But once you've gotten stuck in and know how to do it, even if not very well, it can be therapeutic, it can be relaxing, and it can be fun. Focusing on a single tiny detail at a time, be it a fold in the cloak or the painted highlight going on top. Enthralled, I spent extra time going back over these details that I had made, smoothing the surface, trying to eliminate the smaller cracks and patching this hole that had been created as I pushed the milliput down over the metal thigh pocket of the model, which just acted as a sharp corner underneath my work. But I had to leave it alone to cure at some point. Keeping on poking at it runs ever more risk of me handling it badly and ruining some of the shapes I'm happy with. And this is the result of the first milliput application, and I certainly think the overall shape is how I like it. The way it's draped over the arm and around the back and the hood, even if it's not even, it looks like a hood. But I have more work left to be done, so now it's a new day, the first lot of milliput is cured, let's mix up a fresh batch and add some other details. Some of these new details require a little bit of maths, just a little, not too much. No ghost is complete without the cloak, of course, but also required is the straight silver. A cubit length bayonet carried at all times by the ghosts. Most regiments, I'd go so far as to say all regiments from any planet, like their knives to some extent. Soldiers tend to find them useful in many ways. So I certainly have to include it here. I measured up the 2002 metal Tanith bayonet, some Victoria miniatures bayonets and others and scaled them up by 1.7 to put them in 54 scale. Well, I also took a cubit and 30 centimeters, added a sensible 100mm for the handle and scaled that down so it would be also in 54 scale. And I took all of my different answers, averaged them, and then threw it all out and went with a about this much approach, which has worked for me before. I also guesstimated how big a cap badge might be, and I'll have a go at making that as well. With these guesses at sizes set out, I went back to sculpting. I've mentioned already that it's difficult to shape something hanging in air, so I'm using this plastic box as a backing with some tape as a release agent of sorts. The straight silver scabbard is just a tube of milliput patted down into a roughly short sword shape with some bands added by pressing extra little tubes of milliput over the top. It's somewhat of a simple shape, but a fiddly one regardless. We'll see how it looks once it's mounted on his belt. The cap badge was way more fiddly. It's just so intricate and so small. It is, if I'm honest, beyond my capability. But I gave it a go and we'll see how it ends up. I had some scraps of milliput left over, and so I used them to finish off the cloak and clean up the final details, adding in folds on the now hardened dangling section and smoothing out any texture that I could. Overall, I think I've done fairly well. There's a little more texture than I'd like on the surface, however, most of this will be hidden in the camouflage pattern when I paint it. But this video's rolled on more than long enough, and I'm sure you've all nodded off or clicked to another video long since, so I'll paint this in a separate video. Doesn't it just look so interesting next to the 28mm Cadians, which are much more of a heroic scale? I can even point out that the lasgun on the 28 is the same thickness as on the 54, even though it's supposed to be 1.7 times the size. The big one is just a lot more on the realistic side, true scale, whereas the 28 is really on the heroic side, cartoony proportions. Well, I'll wrap up by inviting you to ask any questions in the comments section below, pop past the links in the description, especially the donation link there, and thank you very much for watching. I'm ED-SKaR, and I always will be.